biological diversity. And today we'll be talking about mainstreaming biosafety. You will remember that in 1992, at the UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Charter was adopted, which outlines building of a just and sustainable, a peaceful global society in the 21st century.
Excuse me, sorry, excuse me, Mr. Peter. I think we are having some problems showing the presentation. Can you just take a look at your screen and see if there is a problem with that? Sorry for interrupt you. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So the Action Plan Agenda 21 for Sustainable Development identified information, integration, and participation as key building blocks to help countries achieve sustainable development. Agenda 21 also stressed the need to change from old sector-centered ways of doing business to new approaches that involve cross-sectoral and coordination and the integration of environmental and social concerns into all development processes. Furthermore, Agenda 21 emphasized that broad public participation in decision-making is a fundamental prerequisite for achieving sustainable development. So, in 1992, as a result of all this, the Convention on Biological Diversity was adopted. And if we look at the CBD tree, we see that 8 years later, the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety was adopted under the convention. And another 10 years later, the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Supplementary Protocol to the Cartagena Protocol was adopted in that same, under that same umbrella, eventually, of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in that same, at the same time, the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing was adopted. Now, if we look at the convention on one side and the protocol on the other side, these two are connected. But how are they connected? Actually, that connection is made in Article 19, Paragraph 3 of the Convention, which provides that parties shall consider a protocol setting out appropriate procedures, including, in particular, advance-informed agreement in the field of the safe transfer, handling, and use of any living modified organism that may have adverse effect on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. Now, before talking about the Cartagena Protocol, we wanted to show you a very short introductory film of 6 minutes of the protocol, which also sets out a little bit the technical side of the protocol. After that, we'll be back to the to this presentation. So the film that we'll be showing you for the next 6 minutes is an introduction, and I hope you will be able to see it. It may be that there could be some delay in receiving that, but after that we'll be back to the presentation. So with this film, we have seen that the Cartagena Protocol is a binding multilateral agreement. It was negotiated under Article 19, Paragraph 3 of the CBD, and it was adopted in January 2000 and is in force since September 2003. Currently, there are 170 parties to the protocol. And the protocol is governed by a meeting of the parties, and that is the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Biosafety, the Cartagena Biosafety Protocol. And the objective of the protocol is to contribute to ensuring the safe transfer, handling, and use of LMOs resulting from modern biotechnology that may have adverse effects on biological diversity, taking also into account risks to human health. Now, that protocol applies to transboundary movement, transit, handling and use of all LMOs that may have adverse effects on biodiversity, taking also into account the risks to human health. It doesn't apply to pharmaceuticals for humans that are addressed by other international agreements or organizations. The protocol establishes different procedures for transboundary movement depending on the type and the intended use of the living modified organism. Living modified organisms for intentional introduction into the environment, for example, certain seeds and live fish, are subject to the Advance Informed Agreement procedure of Article 10. Living modified organisms intended for direct use as food, feed, or processing, and those are usually commodities, for example, soy or canola, cotton, are subject to decisions on domestic use and decisions on import in accordance with Article 11 of the protocol. Whereas LMOs that are intended for contained use, and those could be, for example, bacteria used in laboratories with appropriate safety requirements, they are exempt from the Advance Informed Agreement procedure set out in Article 10. But they may be subject to national standards of the party of import. So for all these different categories of LMOs, different procedures apply. Now, if we look at in a little bit more detail to those procedures, to the two most important procedures. The first one is the procedure applying to living modified organisms for intentional introduction into the environment. We see that there is an Advance Informed Agreement procedure, and that procedure consists of a notification by the party of export to the party of import. The party of import provides an acknowledgement of receipt of that notification and then takes a decision. And that decision is either in accordance with Article 10 or with a domestic framework that is consistent with the objectives of the protocol, and is always based on a risk assessment of the LMO that is to be imported. The country of import takes a final decision, and if later on in the process information becomes available, the country of import could review that decision. So that final decision could be either an import or a prohibition, or it could be allowing the transboundary movement with conditions. If we look at the second procedure, the second most important procedure of the protocol, that is the procedure that applies to LMOs that are intended for direct use as food, feed, or for processing. Now, decisions related to domestic use of LMOs that are intended for food, feed, or for processing, and that may be subject to a transboundary movement, must be made known to the Biosafety clearinghouse. We'll be talking later about the Biosafety clearinghouse. And then an import decision of such LMOs intended for food, feed, or for processing, also known as FFPs, LMOs, FFP. They're subject to the procedure set out in Article 11, or to a domestic framework that is consistent with the objectives of the protocol. Also, that import decision is based on a risk assessment. Now, that final decision is can also be reviewed if there is if later on there is information that that would require a review of that decision. When a party of import takes a decision, the party could consider additional aspects, for example, socio-economical considerations. Those are optional. But one aspect it also should take into consideration, which is not optional, is public consultation set out in Article 23 of the protocol. Now, the final decision, when taken, goes to the notifier, so the party of export, or the notifier in the party of export, and is made known to the Biosafety clearinghouse. And then, assuming that the import is approved or the transboundary movement is approved, the transboundary movement takes place, TBM. And then the protocol also sets out a number of requirements that apply to such transboundary movements, relating, for example, to the handling, packaging, transportation, and documentation of that transboundary movement of LMOs, to risk assessment, risk management, and also in relation to liability and redress. And as we saw in the introductory film, those provisions on the provision on liability and redress led to the adoption of a supplementary protocol on liability and redress, which hasn't, however, entered into force yet. We're missing 4 more ratifications. So these are the two key procedures established by the protocol, applying to these 2 different types of LMOs. If we go back 1 step and recall that CBD tree and see the connection between the convention and the Cartagena Protocol, you will remember that we said that one of the articles of the convention mandated the development of the Cartagena Protocol, which is Article 19.3. But the link between the two is not only Article 19.3. Also, in the terms of objectives of the 2 instruments, there are clear linkages between the 2. And also, there are some substantive common issues that we'll be looking at. So in terms of common objectives, we see that the objectives of the convention are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity. And there's a third objective of the convention that is perhaps less so reflected in the Cartagena Protocol, related to equitable sharing of benefits. If we look at the objectives of the Cartagena Protocol, we recall that the objective of the protocol is to contribute to ensuring an adequate level of protection in the field of the safe transfer, handling, and use of LMOs that may have adverse effects on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So the ultimate objective of the Cartagena Protocol contributes to the overall objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, if we look at the commonalities between the 2 instruments in terms of substance, we see that Article 8G of the Convention provides it contains a provision relating to living modified organisms, and it provides that each contracting party shall establish or maintain means to regulate, manage, or control the risks associated with the use and release of living modified organisms. And also in Article 19, paragraph 4, the Convention addresses living modified organisms and provides that each contracting party shall provide any available information about the use and safety regulations required by that contracting party in handling living modified organisms, as well as any available information on the potential adverse impact. So the Convention also addresses a little bit, or in substance, biosafety in a very in a very concise way, obviously, and then mandated the development of a protocol on this issue. So we see that from that CBD tree, the instruments related to to the convention and the Cartagena Protocol are related in different aspects. But we also know that these international instruments, these multilateral environmental agreements, need to be implemented. And Article 22, paragraph 1 of the protocol requires that parties take the necessary and appropriate legal, administrative, and other measures to implement its obligations under the protocol. Now, the protocol and the convention do not prescribe the exact way in which the provisions need to be implemented, but they do provide guidance. So if we see the instrument, the Cartagena Protocol, as the fruit of the CBD tree, we know that that has to be implemented at the national level, and that leads to the growing of difference that reflect those provisions in different ways. It doesn't need to be the same way in the contracting parties to the Cartagena Protocol. So also in the so now we'll be moving to looking at some aspects of the implementation of the two instruments and see to what extent integration and mainstreaming is reflected in implementation. So if we go back to the convention and look at the provisions that relate to implementation, we see that Article 6 of the convention provides that parties need to develop national strategies, plans, or programs for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, or adapt existing ones for this purpose. Article 6 also provides that parties need to integrate the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity into relevant sectoral or cross-sectoral plans, programs, and policies. Article 8c is also related to implementation, and it provides that parties shall regulate or manage biological resources important for the conservation of biological diversity, with a view to ensuring their conservation and sustainable use. And then lastly, Article 10 of the Convention, paragraphs A and B, are related to implementation, and they provide that parties must integrate consideration of the conservation and sustainable use of biological resources into national decision-making. Parties should also adopt measures relating to the use of biological resources to avoid or minimize adverse impacts on biological diversity. Now, the first aspect of Article 6, the national strategies, plans, or programs, up there on the slide, the first bullet, that is actually a reference to the NBSAPs. And we see that at the national level, parties are required to develop these NBSAPs on the basis of Article 6. And those NBSAPs at the intergovernmental level are to be consistent with the Convention's strategic plan for biodiversity, including then the Aichi biodiversity targets. So these national measures, these national policy instruments, they are to be consistent with the strategic plan for biodiversity that has been adopted by the parties, the contracting parties to the convention. So national implementation is guided in that way by the convention. If we now look at implementation provisions in the protocol, we see, and we already mentioned that Article 2, paragraph 1 of the protocol requires that each party shall take the necessary and appropriate legal, administrative, and other measures to implement its obligations under the protocol. Now, there is no formal equivalent of the NBSAP in relation to the protocol, but the measures that taken and the mechanisms that parties are to establish at the national level to implement a protocol, they are commonly referred to as national biosafety frameworks, but they relate to different aspects. So they relate to policy, to legislation, and to institutions or systems, for example, for decision making, for monitoring, inspection, enforcement, etc. So that entire system at a national level is referred to as national biosafety frameworks. And if we see that these national biosafety frameworks at the national level are to be adopted by countries, by parties at the national level, we also have a similar situation that at the intergovernmental level, parties require that these national biosafety frameworks are consistent or contribute to the implementation of the strategic plan for the Cartagena Protocol. So there is a similar situation that a high-level intergovernmental strategic plan influences or guides the development of measures at the national level. So all instruments, if we look at so we see that the implementation of both the convention and of the protocol is guided by specific provisions in the respective instruments, and then guided by high-level policy strategic frameworks. If we see that under the convention, and go back to the first slide on the CBD tree, that in the different instruments adopted under the Convention on Biological Diversity, addressing different aspects, so for example, the Cartagena Protocol related to biosafety, the Nagoya-Kuala Lumpur Supplementary Protocol on Liability and Redress, and the Nagoya Protocol related to access and benefit sharing, they need to be implemented at the national level. But all ultimately aim at conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So the commonalities and objectives among these different instruments has triggered several calls by the respective governing bodies of the CBD instruments for integrated implementation. Because of these common ultimate objectives, we will now have a look at the decisions by the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol, and some of these decisions that relate to integrated implementation, and to decisions by the Conference of the Parties to the Convention that do the same. So if we look at these decisions by the COP-MOP, the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol, we see that at its 5th meeting, so that was in 2010, the meeting of the parties urged parties and invited other governments to review and align their national action plans and programs relevant to the implementation of the protocol, including their NBSAP, with the strategic plan. And that is the strategic plan that we just saw on a previous slide, applying to the period 2011-2020. And then at its 7th meeting in 2014, the meeting of the parties urged parties and invited other governments to integrate and prioritize biosafety within their national biodiversity strategies and action plans and national development plans and programs as appropriate. So there is a clear call from the meeting of the parties to integrate biosafety in the NBSAPs and in other plans and programs. If we look at similar decisions by the Conference of the Parties to the Convention, we see that at its 12th meeting, the Conference of the Parties encouraged parties to integrate biosafety and access and benefit sharing into national biodiversity strategies and action plans, national development plans, and other relevant sectoral and cross-sectoral policies, plans, and programs. So very similar. As appropriate, taking into account national circumstances, legislation, and priorities. So it's a very similar call by the Conference of the Parties. It also, in Decision 1229, encouraged parties and other governments as appropriate, in accordance with national circumstances and priorities, to strengthen national coordination mechanisms to facilitate a coordinated approach to the implementation of the Convention and its protocols, as well as other biodiversity-related conventions. So, very clearly, the COP/MOP and the COP have called for integrated implementation and integration of the different issues related to the various CBD instruments to make sure that implementation can take place in a coordinated way. But why do we need integration? If we look at the rationale for integration, we recall that there have been various and repeated calls by the Conference of the Parties and the Conference of the Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol for integration. And these calls can be understood for different reasons. And if we go back to the beginning of the presentation, or earlier on in the presentation, we saw that there are several reasons. One of them is that the objectives of both instruments are overlapping in part: conservation and sustainable use. We also see that implementation of the protocol helps the implementation of the convention and vice versa. And so this is in part related to the substantive overlap of some of the provisions of the convention and the protocol. And we also see that a third argument for integration is that integration is actually an inherent part of the convention and the protocol, because the provisions of both call for integration and the decisions taken by the various, by the respective governing bodies call for integration. Now, why would we do that? Integrated implementation could lead to efficiency savings. We will look at those aspects later on. But the second aspect, the second type of reason or rationale for integration is to obtain better financing, and that has become clearer later on in the process. So if we look at integration for efficiency savings, we see that there are a number of aspects that come up under the different CBD instruments that could be addressed or implemented in such a way as to serve the objectives of these different instruments. And there are many examples. For example, risk management related, for example, under, or risk assessment related, for example, under the Convention to systems for invasive alien species, and under the protocol related to living modified organisms. Those mechanisms at the national level could be do not need to be established separately for each of these cases, but also in relation to awareness raising and education, which is addressed both in the convention and in the protocol. There is scope for integrated implementation, as well as in relation to capacity building and information sharing through the BCH. So on all these aspects, integration might lead to efficiency savings, both in terms of human resources, in terms of financial resources. If we look at the other side of integration, we see that mainstreaming has been seen as a key to accessing the necessary resources for biosafety activities and for the implementation of the protocol. And that has been recognized in various decisions of the meeting of the parties to the protocol. At its fifth meeting, in Decision 516, the meeting of the parties urged parties and invited other governments and relevant international organizations to allocate adequate human and financial resources necessary to expedite the implementation of the strategic plan. And it then also urged parties and invited other governments to implement the following strategic measures within the overall framework of the strategy for resource mobilization in support of the Convention on Biological Diversity, with a view to mobilizing additional financial resources for the implementation of the protocol. And it then identified that one of the tools to do that was to mainstream biosafety into national development plans. And, for example, to establish strong outreach programs targeting key policymakers and parliamentarians. In that same decision, 7.5, the meeting of the parties also invited parties and other governments to engage in activities to raise awareness of relevant government officials, including GEF operational focal points, regarding the importance of biosafety and the national obligations under the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, with a view to ensuring due consideration of biosafety in the programming of the national GEF allocations for biodiversity. The same decision also urged parties to improve efforts to access funding for biosafety projects from the Global Environment Facility, GEF, inter alia, through better coordination between the Cartagena Protocol national focal points, CBD national focal points, and GEF operational focal points. So there has been a very clear recognition that mainstreaming, integrated implementation, is an avenue for better funding. Now, if we move, we've now looked at the need for implementation at the national level, the different aspects of implementation and the calls of the provisions related to integration when implementing, and the calls from the respective governing bodies to integrate implementation. And then we looked at the rationale for implementation. It's now time to look at means to, or the question how to integrate biosafety. Here we see a selection of Aichi biodiversity targets. So those were adopted as part of the CBD strategic plan. Biosafety can be relevant in a number of areas and sectors. Many linkages can be established. At the intergovernmental level, there are many Aichi biodiversity targets in the strategic plan for biodiversity for which biosafety can be relevant. And here on the slide you see a selection. At the national level, similar linkages between biosafety and the various sectors can be made. Mainstreaming biosafety into different sectoral and cross-sectoral instruments and institutions is possible, but each country will choose to prioritize certain areas over others. So prioritization is part of the mainstreaming process. So that mainstreaming or integration process consists certainly of 3 steps. The first step is to set priorities and objectives for mainstreaming. The second one is to identify and engage stakeholders and partners. And the third one is to identify entry points. These 3 steps so if we look at priorities and objectives, we see that at the international level, biosafety is part of other objectives and certainly sustainable, of which certain sustainable use and conservation are 2. If we move to the national level and look at objectives, we see that biosafety is part of more objectives. It's not only at the national level that we will look at sustainable use, conservation, and biosafety, but there are other priorities and objectives. For example, development, food security, and health, in which biosafety exists. So the objectives are multiple, and it's likely that countries have many more objectives when we look at it from a wider perspective. And so among all these objectives, countries need to identify certain and prioritize certain objectives when deciding to mainstream. If we move to the second element of the process of integration, we're looking at engaging stakeholders and partners. And so we've seen that the first step is to identify priorities and objectives of mainstreaming in certain sectors or certain within certain cross-sectoral elements, based on a choice of national objectives and priorities. For example, sustainable development or food security. Depending on those objectives and priorities, stakeholders need to be engaged, and those will be different in a country that identifies agriculture and forestry as priorities from a country in which food safety and environment will be identified as objectives and priorities. So once objectives and priority areas for mainstreaming have been set, stakeholders can be engaged. And those stakeholders will represent various levels of different sectoral stakeholders. They can be public stakeholders, such as indigenous peoples and local communities, general public, but they can also be private stakeholders, for example, industry and farmers. Stakeholders could be sectoral, but also intersectoral stakeholders. And then it is like stakeholders will comprise academic institutions and others. So all these stakeholders from different levels need to be engaged and selected depending on the priorities and objectives that have been set. So why should we involve those stakeholders? Stakeholder involvement is in many countries a mandatory part of decision-making and policy development. The protocol addresses some aspects related to public awareness and participation in Article 23, which also relates to inclusion of stakeholders. In addition, there are various practical reasons to involve stakeholders. They can provide information and perspectives of which the policymaker would otherwise not be aware. So we saw that due process could be involvement of stakeholders on the basis of due process could be a national requirement for involvement of stakeholders. So stakeholders could also provide information to the process. But involving stakeholders also creates awareness and enhances the understanding of biosafety issues, which creates support for the implementation of the protocol. So for all these reasons, stakeholders need to be involved. But in addition, and partly overlapping with these reasons, stakeholder involvement is an important principle of good governance, and that principle exists among a number of good governance principles. For example, accountability, or the need for consensus orientation, empowerment and participation, transparency and access to information. So all these good governance principles together with stakeholder involvement are required to take decisions that are in line with the good governance principles. The third aspect of the three building blocks or steps, if you want, of the integration process that we saw earlier on, the first one was setting objectives or priorities, the second one was engaging stakeholders, and the third one was to identify entry points. So when we talk about entry points, we talk, for example, we can take the national biosafety frameworks as an example. So those the national biosafety frameworks relate to policy, legislation, and systems. Biosafety is part of the policy of the entire suite of policy instruments at the national level, the entire system of legal instruments in a country, and also partly addressed in the institutional aspects of a country. So biosafety exists at the policy, the legal, and institutional level within a variety, a wide range of other instruments and institutions. And so it is necessary to set these entry points and to identify entry points within the entirety of your national policy instruments, your national legal instruments, and your national systems. So if we look at policies, we see that for each of the elements of the national biosafety framework, these potential entry points need to be filtered down, because we saw that there are many policy instruments, for example, that that could serve as entry points for biosafety. Biosafety could be integrated in many different policy instruments, but from that whole range of policy instruments that could potentially serve to integrate biosafety in, we would like to filter down to a smaller number of policy instruments on which we'll focus. That could, for example, be the NBSAP. It could also be trade policies or poverty reduction strategies in a country, or sustainable development strategies. But how do we filter? To filter down from the entire range of potentially relevant instruments or institutions, we can use a number of criteria, and some are presented on this slide. We could, for example, look at which instrument, integration to which instrument would provide the highest added value. So where can the biggest difference be made? That is related to the greatest potential. So where would the greatest potential be made? If we integrate biosafety in an NBSAP, that could have a great potential. If we integrate biosafety in a policy where, in a field where biosafety is not yet or not really an issue, the potential could be much less. We could also filter according to the criteria of the low-hanging fruit. We could look at policies or legal instruments or institutions that would be most easily targeted. We can also look at or approach the filtering from a perspective of looking at the respective stakeholders and engaged in those policies and institutions, and see where the easiest collaboration could be established. And then there could be specific opportunities that make filtering easier. For example, there is an ongoing drafting process of a certain policy or a certain legal instrument, and that could be an opportunity to ensure that biosafety is also addressed in that policy or legal instrument. There could be a budget revision ongoing, and it might be opportune to ensure that biosafety is addressed in the budget. There could be institutional changes that are ongoing, for example, in the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Agriculture, and commissions are being established or altered, and biosafety might be a consideration that could be addressed in these new or changing institutions. There could be a change of government from a government that is not so interested in biosafety, or that is developing new priorities, and it might be opportune to ensure that the importance of biosafety is brought to the attention of the new government. There could be crises or hazards that might be an opportunity to ensure that biosafety is taken into consideration. There could also be donor discussions and priority areas within those discussions. If there are big changes to important cross-sectoral policies, for example, related to development or trade or environment, integration of biosafety could be that could be a good opportunity to think about biosafety integration. Now, we've seen the objectives and the priorities. We looked at stakeholder involvement. We looked at entry points. And we saw some filtering criteria to make sure that the potential huge range of entry points, both at the policy, legal, and institutional level, can be reduced to the most opportune or likely ones. There are also some tools and approaches through which biosafety can be mainstreamed. And those tools and approaches could be relevant at the policy, the legal, and the institutional level. And one of them is, for example, environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental assessment, in which by the impact of LMOs could be addressed. There could also be economic tools or incentives and taxes on certain good behavior, or the private standards and voluntary certification systems of industry or users that would benefit or put a reward on behavior that is in line with the objectives of the protocol. There could also be good practice guidelines, or the ecosystem approach to the management of certain sectors could also include or be inclusive of consideration of biosafety aspects. So within these existing tools and approaches, biosafety could be part of the considerations. So we see again the slide on the different steps: priorities and objective setting, engagement of stakeholders and partners, and identification of entry points. Mainstreaming biosafety can be set out in a mainstreaming strategy. That would be a tool to guide the mainstreaming or integration process. So we've discussed these important 3 steps before, but probably the mainstreaming strategy would address other aspects as well. So if we look at the building blocks for the integration strategy, we already looked at the entry points, the priorities and objectives, and the identification of stakeholders and partners. But other aspects would be communication and awareness building. We saw that in relation to engagement of stakeholders, but also in general about biosafety, communication and awareness building of biosafety, to make sure that the appropriate level of attention is devoted to biosafety in the different instruments and the different institutions. Obviously, there is an important aspect of the integration strategy or the mainstreaming strategy would be to have to address capacity building. And then last but not least, one aspect are resources. So which resources can be allocated to the to biosafety mainstreaming, and which resources can be used for biosafety mainstreaming, because we also saw that mainstreaming could be an avenue for finding resources. Now, all these aspects are building blocks for integration and building blocks of your integration strategy. If we now move to mainstreaming biosafety and real practice examples, we see that among the different policy instruments, the NBSAP would be a very likely and opportune instrument into which biosafety can be mainstreamed. And there are several reasons for that. One is that the objectives and some of the substance of the CBD and the Cartagena Protocol are overlapping. So the instrument to implement the convention at the national level in the policy instrument, the NBSAP, would be a likely choice to integrate biosafety. Also, there have been several calls by the respective governing bodies to do that, and they have identified the NBSAP specifically to integrate biosafety into. Also, there might be institutional aspects that make integration of biosafety into NBSAPs possible. For example, connections between the national authorities of the two instruments. They might sometimes be in the same ministry, or at least they will be aware of each other and might be communicating to each other. And so we already mentioned that there are areas of convergence in substance. For example, Article 8G and Article 19.4 of the Convention. So from a look at different NBSAPs, it seems that at least 50 existing NBSAPs address biosafety in various ways. Some mention biosafety and the need for implementation of the protocol, for example in Albania. Others identify priority areas or specific identify biosafety as a priority area or a specific theme, or develop specific strategic goals and national targets, or even develop a specific biosafety action plan. So we see that those the NBSAPs, these 50 NBSAPs address biosafety in a range of ways. Some are very detailed on biosafety, others are just only mention it. So mainstreaming biosafety in NBSAPs is certainly possible and has been done in at least 50 countries. So with this, my presentation ends, and I would like to invite you to pose any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Many thanks, Mr. Dillman, for this interesting topic for our NBSAP forum members. I am sure our audience enjoyed the presentation. As Mr. Dillman pointed out, I want to invite our participants to share your questions, doubts, and comments, or raise your hand to participate in the Q&A session. Please use the control panel of the GoToWebinar platform in your computer. We can also open your microphone or read your questions, whatever you think it's better, or depending on the connection. Okay, let me see. Okay, we have a question. What are the 3 most important steps a country can take to begin mainstreaming biosafety during NBSAP implementation?
Okay, so let me just write that down. So I think the three most important steps if you want to start integrating biosafety into your NBSAP is first of all to identify the relevant stakeholders. So the relevant stakeholders of your those involved in the drafting of the NBSAP or the revision of the NBSAP should be communicating to those involved in biosafety, competent national authorities, for example, on biosafety. So that would be the first step. Then the second step would be to identify the priorities of your national biosafety instruments or policy documents, and see to what extent and filter out what you need to be reflected in your NBSAPs in terms of biosafety. So that would be a policy. The policy aspects would need to be prepared for insertion in that in the NBSAP. So I mentioned stakeholders, the objectives, and you asked for a third. Not sure. I think those are the most important ones. And then you would need to look at certain. I could think of looking at specific. You would have to then start a discussion with those involved in the revision of your NBSAP to see where in what elements biosafety could best be mainstreamed. Would you just mention biosafety in your NBSAP, or would you like to develop an entire action plan, or develop specific goals, activities, etc.? So the level of the extent to which biosafety will be integrated into the NBSAP will then need to be discussed.
We have a comment from Alex Owusu Binay. A third could be highlighting biosafety actions in the action plans in the NBSAP.
Yes. So those are, that's a very good point. So so depending then on the extent to which you want to integrate biosafety in your NBSAP, you might want to specify not only goals and objectives, but work out specific actions and allocate specific resources or for those. So that is a discussion that will have to be held with those involved in the revision process of your NBSAP, and obviously also depend very much on the availability of resources.
Thank you, Mr. Derman. Other question, ideas to finance biosafety mainstreaming.
The ideas for financing it, I think there might be a number of steps can be taken that would not require additional resources. So if your biosafety, if those involved in biosafety at the national level can engage with stakeholders of other sectors, or those reviewing your the NBSAP, and existing policies on biosafety can be used as a basis for integration of specific elements into your NBSAP, is not necessarily a process that would require a huge amount of additional resources. So when you move to implementation of specific biosafety activities, those might require resources, but those, I don't think that is necessarily an aspect of that is necessarily related to the fact that they have been mainstreamed somewhere. That could also be, that would be the same if they would be carried out under a sectoral only biosafety policy. So I think at least from the side of development of the integration of biosafety aspects into NBSAPs, that does not necessarily have to cost a huge amount of money.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Doman. I just want to remind to our audience that you can send the questions or raise your hand through the GoToWebinar platform. So feel free to send us in advance. I have another question here. Resources to help explain biosafety principles to stakeholders who are not familiar with the concepts. Biosafety might be a complex concept to explain, so especially taking into account that some of the stakeholders identified are general public. So where those resources can be found to explain biosafety principles to these stakeholders?
Yeah, I think there are, if you're talking about the general public, there are a number of materials available on our website that could be used to raise public awareness of biosafety issues. But in the integration of biosafety in NBSAPs, I think it's also very important that at the institutional level there is appropriate awareness raising of biosafety, and that biosafety is obviously of a different level, and different tools can be used. But the first step to take is to reach out to those involved in your NBSAP revision process to make sure that there are institutional linkages, or at least that colleagues talk to each other. What we sometimes see that at national level, different authorities don't communicate enough. And that would be a first burden or a first barrier to overcome. And so obviously then there is also the involvement of the general public in biosafety issues that should be addressed. But this at the institutional level is a very awareness raising is very important too.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Ileana Lopez. I'm going to try to open your microphone. Ileana, can you hear us?
I am muted.
Hello, Mrs. Ileana, how are you? Okay, I'm going to read her question. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I will suggest to work closely with the national office responsible to prepare the NBSAPs, most of the time at the same ministry, not necessarily, and join the ongoing CBD and UN environment process to build synergies among biodiversity-related conventions. Okay, I have another question from Sol Ortiz. Thank you for a very interesting webinar. Our question is, which criteria do you consider are more important for prioritizing biosafety at the national level, considering the variety of issues that different parties face?
I think the priorities depend very much on your. If we talk about the in selecting entry points, I think priorities very much depend on the national circumstances. So, if for a country LMOs are at the policy level seen as a way to ensure food security or to contribute to food security, if that is the case, then it might be an area in which so food production, agriculture might be an obvious entry point for biosafety integration. If other priorities are sort of national at the national level exist, then that could be different. So from that perspective, I think at the higher level, the identification of these entry points would be related to your, would depend on your national priorities. It would be difficult to set specific more important or less important priorities in terms of instruments or institutions. But obviously, an NBSAP is is probably a very obvious entry point, so then we're talking about biological diversity, conservation, and sustainable use. So as priorities.
Thank you, Mr. Dillman. I don't see more questions, but I want to invite one more time to our participants to send us, the questions or raise the hand in order to participate in this webinar. Okay, it seems like there is no more questions. So many thanks again, Mr. Dillman, for your time. And thank you all for your participation in this webinar. Remember the third part of this webinar series in November. It would be next November 9th at 8 a.m. New York time. The name of the webinar, ABS as an Innovative Financing Mechanisms, How to Make It Work, presented by Dr. Bala Pisupati from UNEP. I would like to thank again Mr. Dillman for your participation and for your interest in this topic.
Yes, thank you very much for having invited us to talk about mainstreaming biosafety. For us, it's a very important aspect, and I look forward to seeing your next webinar. And thank you all for listening and engaging in discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dillman. Thank you very much for the Convention on Biological Diversity. Please check out our website to get the list of resources provided by this webinar. You can also watch the recording also from our site. Remember to register or update your profile in the NBSAP forum. Send us your thoughts on other webinar topics you would like to discuss in an upcoming session. I am Diego Ochoa from the NBSAP forum. Feel free to send us your comments, suggestions, and recommendations for this learning opportunity. I hope you all enjoyed these sessions. Please join us in our next webinar in November. Thank you very much again, Mr. Dillman, and see you in November. Bye.
Yes. Bye-bye.